amazing speakers across the state to come over and talk to us about all these different things. So
Cool
I'm
stuff.
super happy to have you here today because I know everybody loves burrowing owls, of course. I mean,
They're hard
uh,
not to like.
yeah, I don't know many birds that are much cuter than them. So they're really cool too. Very interesting. Okay. Well, I think some more people might just join as we're getting started, but I'm just gonna go ahead, um, move along. So welcome everybody, like I said, to the September J Chat. Just before we get started, I have a few reminders. Number one, welcome to the Florida Young Birders Club. We're super glad to have you today. Our group is a statewide one in Florida that's helping to connect kids to with an interest in birds and birding and conservation. We run awesome events throughout the year. We have monthly J Chat September through April, and then we also do field trips to really cool places throughout Florida. Um, and then also, if you aren't already part of our group, we would love to have you. Please consider joining and becoming a member. I think you would really enjoy our group. A few other reminders today throughout the presentation. Everyone's going to be muted. Your video is going to be turned off. And then at the end, we're going to have a Q&A portion. And during that, I'll just open up the chat box, and that's how we're going to ask our questions. And then also just remember to be respectful. So a little bit about our amazing speaker today, Zachary. So he is a master's graduate student at UF in the Department of Wildlife Ecology and Conservation. He's worked in the Rangeland Wildlife Ecology Lab. He studied grassland birds and how they're responding to different land management practices throughout South Central Florida. He's worked with a bunch of amazing groups like FWC. He's worked at research stations and has been a private environmental consultation as an avian ecologist for interesting species. So he also has some future goals to research applied avian conservation questions. So Zach, I'm gonna hand it over to you and you can present about the amazing Florida burrowing owl. So I'm gonna stop sharing and you can take on over.
Sweet. Thank you so much for that introduction. It's great to be here. Let me pull up my presentation real quick. Oh, sneak peek into the middle. Here we go. Let's start from the beginning. Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. It's so great to be here, and I'm really interested in hearing all your thoughts and questions later. So today I'm going to talk about Florida burrowing owls. So as Blair mentioned, I study grassland birds, and a lot of people don't realize that we have a lot of grasslands in Florida. And one of the birds that I've worked with in the past and that I'm studying in a remote way now is the Florida burrowing owl. So we're going to jump into all things owls today, and I'm really excited about it. So to back up a little bit, owls are just an incredibly unique and cool group of species. There's over 200 owls throughout the species of owls throughout the world, and most of them are nocturnal, which means they're really active during the night. You know, the very they're loud and they're really great predators and they hunt at night. But the one we're talking about today is not that way. And we'll get to that in a minute. They're excellent predators. They're all of their biology and their ecology really gets them to be great predators at night. They have those really big eyes. And they're actually more closely related to hummingbirds than all of our other birds of prey, like our hawks and our eagles and vultures. So they evolved slightly differently. The largest owl stands at about 5 feet tall, and it's called the fish. It's one of the fish owls out in Russia. And the smallest owl is actually called an elf owl, and it's only 6 inches, and it weighs less than a golf ball. So owls are really cool. But the one we're talking about today is the Florida burrowing owl, or burrowing owls in general. So they're not nocturnal, which means they're not active at night. They're actually active during the day. And instead of hiding out in trees and looking for prey from the forest, they actually are in our grasslands and they burrow underground, which is not very typical. They evolved in grasslands, so in order to um, escape predators and find prey and keep cool. They actually learn to live underground. And there are quite a lot of burrowing owls throughout the world. There's different what's called subspecies. So they're all the same species type, but they're isolated from each other. So they evolve slightly differently. So the ones here in Florida um, are a little bit different from everywhere else. So each of these red circles shows a different group of burrowing owls or different subspecies of burrowing owls. The ones out west are actually migratory. So this red color means that's where they're at during the breeding season, which is usually during the spring and summer months. And then this blue down here in Mexico is where they are during the winter. The purple color means they're burrowing owls that stay there year round. They don't really what's called migrate, so they don't move back and forth from the breeding to the non-breeding season. So the ones here in Florida are here year round, and so are some of these other different subspecies. I've been lucky enough to work with burrowing owls in two places. Here, of course, in Florida, and I've also been out to Oregon, which is on the west coast, that left star there, and worked with some of the migratory species too. So you'll see some photos from both places, but today I'm mostly going to focus, excuse me, on the Florida group. So the ones out west, we see that burrowing owls, you know, aren't able to dig their own burrows. So they live underground, but they can't make their own homes. So they actually evolved to nest with prairie dogs, which is that left photo there. So they will find prairie dog holes or other existing burrows and move right on in. And that habitat looks a lot like this. It's very open, it's treeless, it's really good to spot predators and spot prey. And this right photo actually shows an artificial burrow up on the top right. You see those rocks right here, and you see a little entrance. So we'll talk more about artificial burrows towards the end. But this is a really cool open habitat. But in Florida, they learned how to dig their own burrows, mostly because in Florida we have super sandy soil. So this range, as seen on this map by FWC, shows that most of the burrowing owl range is in what's called peninsular Florida, so mostly towards the central and south part, where it's really sandy. And all of these dots showed where burrowing owls were known to exist. So this map's a little outdated. This is from 2018, so we know a few more spots now, but it's a good picture for where burrowing owls exist throughout the state. And this blue star, as you see on that map, is where I worked with burrowing owls, which is in Pasco County, so just north of Tampa on a place called Crossbar Ranch. And it was a managed protected property, and some of you may have been able to go there before because we did a Young Birders Club field trip. But it's a really cool property that has scrub jays and burrowing owls on this area that's protected for wildlife. So if you can see, based on this map, you see that there's a lot of points clustered around the center of the state and along the coast, and that's because a lot of this habitat was open habitat that was once grassland. So here on this map, you see that that black border, there's a lot of historic, what's called dry prairie and wet prairie habitat. And that's really important because that's what owls in Florida evolved with the nice treeless landscape, very open, and that's where all of our prairies used to exist. So the habitat that burrowing owls got accustomed to or evolved with, it looked a lot like this. So this bottom left corner is our dry prairie habitat. It's very open, and then we have some scrub up in the top right corner, which is another habitat type that's known for open sandy patches. Sometimes they can get a little dense, so not all burrowing owls will move in, but especially on the periphery or the edge of this scrub habitat, you also see some burrowing owls. So they really like that sandy soil. They like to use perch points, so they'll always try to find the highest point still so they can get a great view of prey or predators. They like those open spaces, and food is a really big driver for their ability to move in and survive. So as you can see based on this map, while a lot of that prairie habitat once existed here now, this map also shows in yellow where current ranch lands or cattle pastures are. So Florida produces a lot of cows. And cattle habitat actually, or cattle pastures actually serve as great habitat for burrowing owls, even though it's not the pristine pasture that they evolved with. So what's really cool about burrowing owls is that if you make habitat that they like, sometimes they'll move in even if you don't expect to. So cow pastures, like the ones that you may have seen when you came up to Crossbar Ranch with me, like in the bottom left corner here, is great habitat. It's very, a wide open space. Usually fence posts are great perch points. Usually not too many trees, so that's really great for them. But burrowing owls have also been known to move into more urban sites. So airports, like this top right corner, have always been a spot where some burrowing owls happen to move in, especially as the rest of their habitat kind of changes to other development or other buildings. And we also have a population that have moved into some of those urban sites and moved into people's yards, like down in Marco Island and Fort Myers in Southwest Florida. So sometimes these burrowing owls are smart enough to move into some of these urban landscapes, but that comes with its own challenges too that we have to be careful of. So we're going to talk about burrowing owl ecology, and that's basically, what makes a burrowing owl a burrowing owl, and all it, everything it does, and it's adapted to be successful and survive. So burrowing owls are what's called opportunistic hunters, which is a fancy way of saying they will eat anything they can get, their claws on. So a lot of times that's insects. They love, beetles, bugs, butterflies, dragonflies, grasshoppers is one of their favorites. So they'll really focus on that, but they also really like wetland edges and wetland ditches. So if there's a wetland ditch or wetland near a pasture or near the dry prairie, which is known to flood occasionally, they'll really take advantage of frogs, snakes, lizards, and of course, they also love rodents. Um, they really only have one main predator in the natural world, as adults, so that's the Cooper's hawk, which is seen on that top right photo. As babies, as eggs or chicks, a lot of times they fall victim to all the other predators that baby birds kind of fall victim to, which is usually snakes, sometimes mammals. But usually the burrows are too small in Florida for most mammals to get all the way to the chamber where they're actually incubating their eggs. So not too many predation events occur out besides snakes and Cooper's hawks here. What's really interesting about how they hunt and what they do at their burrows, if you can see in this bottom left photo, there's actually some poop or some scat, most likely from coyotes or other mammals, that burrowing owls actually go out, they find it, they collect it, and they put it at the entrance of their burrow. And most people think it's because it's that attracts bugs and beetles, which makes a real easy dinner. So we always think that's really cool. And each burrow is different and they decorate it however they want with whatever poop they like. So it's a fun fact. This map shows the site that I was talking about, Crossbar Ranch. This is one of the pastures that we actually survey. So understanding how burrowing owls use their habitat and to protect them and conserve them, we always try to track where the burrows are. So burrowing owls actually in Florida will dig and use more than just one. So the one they use the most is called the primary burrow, and that's used as the nest site and the primary roosting location for the female or the mom. And during the breeding season, only she will use that burrow, and that's where they'll hatch and be raised. But the secondary burrows are equally as important, and this is where they cache food. So caching food is a fancy way of saying like that's their pantry. That's where they're going to store food, in case it doesn't all get used, nothing goes to waste. So one study actually showed that there was up to 100 rodents in one of these food caches. So when it's a good time to hunt, they'll always catch it and use it. They just might not use it just that moment. So it's important to use those secondary burrows too. This is also the spot where the males during the breeding season will roost and hang out during the day and during night. So they don't always go to the same spot. We also keep track of old burrows because burrows are such a hot commodity for these guys that they almost will from year to year use some of those old burrows too. Sometimes they'll also use gopher tortoise burrows. that are no longer occupied by the gopher tortoises. So we can try to keep track of all of that in terms of, maybe those owls might move back in. And it's a really cool and beneficial way to have multiple burrows to escape to if needed to escape from a predator too. So this map kind of shows each of those different groups. So every number relates to a specific pair and a specific nest site. So the P's are primary with yellow dots, and you can see that sometimes they'll go really far for their secondary burrows, and sometimes they'll stay really close. And that really depends on where they feel is a good vantage point to search for predators and prey. Also, where is the easiest spot to dig? So they'll usually start in an area that already has some exposed sand, which can sometimes be hard to come by in this situation where it's a cattle pasture. So um, usually along fence rows, which is what you see on the very left here. There's 3 burrows right along the fence row there. That's usually a great place to start because that's where the cows are usually walking back and forth, and it's easier to dig. So burrowing owls usually live between 7 to 10 years, and that's kind of the max age that has ever been recorded. They start breeding in late winter, like most birds of prey. So unlike our songbirds, birds of prey like owls and hawks usually start breeding and start forming up as couples in January to February. Then they'll lay their first eggs. Incubation of those eggs usually takes just under a month. And after that, it takes about 12 weeks to fledge, which means from the time that they hatch to the time that they can actually leave the cavity or the burrow on their own. The clutch size, or the number of eggs each pair have, can be up to 8 eggs. Most of the time, we see that many eggs occur out west with the western subspecies. Because they're migratory, they actually try to put a little bit more effort into raising more young. But here in Florida, usually it's only 3 to 4. 4 being the predominant number that I've seen. So they will what's called have one clutch. So sometimes birds, especially songbirds, will have multiple clutches or reproduce and lay eggs multiple times to get as many young out during the breeding season. But burrowing owls won't do it again if their first clutch or their first attempt was successful. Even if it's just only getting one young to fledge the nest, they most likely will not re-nest. So this picture, oh, I'm sorry, this back picture here on the bottom left, this is a female incubating or chicks that hatched just 2 days before this. And this is in an artificial burrow out in Oregon. So they design it. I'll show you the design in a minute, but we can get to peek in there. And then these young over here on the right are under a week old. So you can see that they're just starting to get some of their what's called pin feathers, and their eyes are still closed, so they're still completely reliant on the parents. This picture over here on the right is really close to fledging. So this is probably anywhere between 9 to 10 weeks after hatch. They're almost completely independent, but still not quite ready to leave the nest. So we actually were able to take all of these young out, and I'll show you in a minute what we did with them, but put them in a bucket and put some bands on them, which was really cool and exciting. So when they get to this age, they can still move around a bit more. So once they're able to walk out of the cavity or walk out of the burrow by their own, a lot of times the first thing they'll do is they'll find the secondary or the satellite burrow because they know there's more food there that dad has stored up. So they move around a little bit, but they're usually not hunting on their own until after 12 weeks. But they build a lot of time with their parents, and they learn a lot of time with from their parents, including like they learn their vocal attributes from the males, usually, and then they also learn to hunt. Unfortunately, our sound's not working, but if you Google burrowing owls vocals, it's a really interesting call, and they have different types of calls that mean different things. So if you Google that and go to eBird or All About Birds online, you can see the different types of call types, and some of them mean warning, there's a predator nearby, run away, and some of them are more contact calls because they're very social birds. And there we go. So now we're going to move on to what burrowing owl conservation looks like. And there's a lot of really interesting parts to this species, especially here in Florida, that we need to keep in mind. I know some of y'all are potentially reading the book Hoot, which is an amazing book, and talks a little bit about some of the threats burrowing owls face. So here in Florida, they are listed as threatened by the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission. And that means that every species in the state is looked at a conservation perspective to see, are they in threat or endangered to extinction or continuing to persist in the wild. So burrowing owls are listed as threatened, which is like one step down from endangered. And so they are protected, and we need to actively manage and conserve them so they can stick around. The biggest threat to this species is loss of habitat due to either development, even though they have been able to move into urban areas, not all of them adapt to that. So throughout the state, there's not too many that do that. It's kind of really only in two main spots. So development and improper management. So it's not just conserving the areas that they do well in, but it's also really important to manage that habitat for the owls and how they like it. When they evolved on dry prairie habitat, it was naturally managed by naturally occurring fire and flooding to keep back the trees and all the forests. So they actually had their own the habitat there. But if we conserve that area and don't do fire and other management practices, that habitat is no longer suitable for them either. In rare cases, burrowing owls will move into areas that we either can't save or it's not conducive for whatever reason, and we will use translocation or relocation of those owls. A lot of times that happens, like for this group, on airports. So they move into an airport and we don't let them to become casualties of the planes, and the airport safety says they can't be there. So sometimes we do use translocation as a tool to try to save that pair and move them to protected suitable habitat. Although it's not super common, so we can't rely on it completely. But when we do these relocations, we have to set up what's called artificial burrows. And a lot like your nest boxes for either your bluebirds or kestrels or woodpeckers or any other species that kind of use a nest box, this is kind of like a replacement home that we set up. And it requires just two or three main components on the unprotected lands. It of course includes some type of box or bin that they will actually use as the nest cavity itself, and you'll bury that and lead a tube. Usually this black tube is what's commonly used, and you'll do a gentle slope from the nest box up to the surface. And that slope's really important because we want to make sure the young actually can climb out in time. And then usually they include a little perch right next to it just to help that pair do well, search for predators, search for prey. And it also helps mark where they are because they are incredibly hard to find on their own sometimes. So when we build these artificial burrows, sometimes, like I said, it's for translocation, but it can also be installed for other purposes, like attracting burrowing owls for suitable habitat. When populations or burrowing owls as a whole, kind of their population gets small or low and they are threatened, so sometimes their numbers aren't high enough where they'll find new habitat readily. So sometimes we put these artificial burrows in to show that this is potentially good habitat for them. And burrowing owls use a visual test to try to see like which habitat's good enough. So a lot of times they'll search for gopher tortoise aprons, so the big sandy areas. If there's not a lot of sand available or visual to them as they're flying over, they may not stop and kind of check things out. Or the other reason we put in artificial burrows is to increase the existing number of birds. So if an area is hard to dig in, or for whatever reason, birds seem to be moving off site and we think that site could support more burrowing owls, we will try to put in some more artificial burrows to help them along. So these are really great tools for us to use to try to help conserve the species. So this is a couple photos of us out in Oregon where we're installing some of these artificial burrows. Oregon's a little bit different than Florida, where it's not as sandy. There's a lot of rocks in the dirt. So, and these birds out west don't dig their own. So a little bit different, but just I wanted to show the process here that we also have that big cavity, which is the cut up blue bin. And then because they were tracking this population really closely and banding them, they actually added this black bucket on top that's right at surface level. So when we're ready to extract the birds, we can just open up the lid and look right into the nest. But making sure that gentle slope comes all the way up to the surface as you see in that right picture, and then we make a little apron or a little open gravelly sandy spot right at the entrance for them. And we include these big rocks that you see on that left photo, so no coyotes or other predators could potentially try to dig it up. So, and this is the finished product. You can see the general habitat in the background. It's very low, grassland habitat, and then you see our burrow entrance right there on the right, or in the bottom right. So, as we understand that burrowing owls are moving into areas that they didn't evolve with, it's not really grassland habitat, it's not protected. Sometimes they are used for other purposes, and the big example of that is with cows. So we have the opportunity to really expand the amount of suitable habitat for burrowing owls by allowing them to move into cattle pastures and livestock production ranches. But there are some threats that come with that that we need to be aware of and manage for. One of the biggest threats with cattle and farm equipment is that burrows can collapse. So this left picture kind of shows what the entrance to a burrow could look like, but this burrow, it's hard to tell, has actually been collapsed by a cow. And when that happens, it can be really hard because if it's the primary burrow, those young can't dig themselves back out. Sometimes adults can, depending on where the collapse happens, and they'll still survive, but it takes a lot of time and energy for those adults to redig those burrows. So it's really important that we try to protect these burrows from potential collapse, even in this new suitable habitat. And if you went to Crossbar Ranch on the field trip, you probably saw some of these on the right here. I know this is a relatively bad photo. I couldn't find one that was nice, but this kind of shows the protector we put in around the burrow with the owl underneath it, and this just prevents cattle from entering that area because those stakes are buried into the ground, and it also tells farm ranchers and managers where those burrows are so they don't accidentally run over them when they're mowing the fields. So it's important even in modified landscapes like cattle pastures to keep track of where these owls are and try to prevent any undue collapse. Now, some people might say, hey, let's just kick the cows off. But without burning or without managing that habitat in any other way, the cows are actually really good at keeping the vegetation down. So cows are actually used as a tool to create suitable habitat. We just got to make sure that they're also not accidentally collapsing burrows. Now, urban landscapes create their own unique challenges and challenges that are much harder to tackle. Urban ecosystems, as we know from our songbirds, can have a lot of threats such as cars constantly moving by, buildings and window collisions. Cats are a big problem with wild birds, and of course, food availability. So all these photos are actually from Audubon's website, and the Audubon of the West Everglades down in Southwest Florida shows a lot of really cool opportunities for citizens to get involved with understanding where these burrowing owls are living within the houses and yards, and a lot of these owls live, as you can see in these photos, live right next to people's houses. But trying to make people aware and use it as an education tool is great. Roping it off so they don't get collapsed from mowing is also really great. And trying not to use potentially harmful chemicals like pesticides and herbicides is also really important, since these birds are eating probably a lot of frogs and bugs that are found right in people's yards. So it's really cool that they move into urban landscapes and utilize that, but we have to make sure we manage and conserve them in their own unique way. And one of the great tools, as I kind of mentioned a couple times with burrowing owls, is banding. And if you've taken Mr. Jim's class and seen a lot of his banding at the school or at the banding station, you kind of are already familiar with this. But we catch them in a kind of a different way. So mist nets are great for smaller birds, but you can't really use mist nets too well out in the grasslands. So as you can see, these burrowing owls are pretty small. They're just about a little over the size of my hand up in that top left picture. And we still put that unique metal band on their leg, as you see in that top right picture, when they're about 10 weeks old. But if you're so catching the young is really easy if you have access to the nest cavity, like I showed in that previous picture. In that black bucket, we kind of just pull the lid off, can reach right in and grab them. That's the easiest case. But a lot of times we don't get that ability, especially here in Florida, when they're digging their own burrows. We don't know how long they are, and we can't get into the cavity. So we use a metal trap. This trap is usually used for small rodents or mammals. That shows down here in the bottom right photo. And basically, once an animal enters in from the left and steps on that metal plate in the center, the door behind them closes. So what we do is we keep that trap covered, and then we play the sound of a burrowing owl calling at the other side of the trap. And it usually for adults, they're really, really protective of those burrows because they're such a scarce commodity or a scarce opportunity for them to actually use that they'll come out running because they're so protective of their areas. And they'll get into the trap, and then we can pull them out and put some bands on them. Now we can get really fancy with this. Instead of just the metal band, like in the right photo on that right leg, it kind of just has that metal band. But we can also put this blue band on them sometimes, and that allows us to identify the individual owls on in the habitat on the landscape, and we can identify them without having to re-catch them. And that can be really useful when you're trying to track movements and trying to see where those owls are going. So you can just use binoculars and read that number and that letter as you see on that blue band, and we can actually track where they're going. This left photo shows an even fancier thing that they're doing, and that's putting actually a satellite tracker on them. So this is getting, we don't have to recatch the bird again until we go in to remove that tracker. And this sends signals up to a satellite, which comes back to a researcher and shows everywhere that bird has been moving, everywhere that bird might be going. This is really important for the migratory species, but also really important in Florida. A study that was done here in Florida shed a lot of light on some new populations of owls that we weren't aware of before. It also shows where they're hunting, how far they're moving, and all of that's really important to understand when we're trying to conserve this species on a state level and trying to know which habitats it's using and how to manage it appropriately. So those are all the tools we kind of use, in our, especially as we're surveying for these owls, and tools we're trying to implement when we try to conserve these species. And I will end with just a short little video here of what happens after we're done catching them and pulling them out of the cavity. We, of course, release them, and they run back into their burrow. You can kind of see all the poop that's around this entrance that the adults brought in, and we just let it go, and it awkwardly will run back into this cavity. And it's so cute. So, let's see if I can go here. There we go. In conclusion, thank you so much for having me. Florida burrowing owls are an amazing species on our grasslands and on our rangelands here in Florida. They are threatened and need a lot of help still, and we already know so much about them, but really the best thing we can do to help keep them around is to protect the land that they're already on, manage the land for their success, and be aware of when they move in town. I'm happy to answer any questions. I think we're going to do that through the chat. And feel free to ask me questions about burrowing owls in general or birds in general, anything I I've done, in terms of work and jobs. I'm happy to answer any bird related or job related questions. So thanks for having me. Ooh, you're muted, Blair.
There we go. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so thank you so much. That was awesome. Just a reminder, just for the adults that may be in the meeting right now, thank you for attending the presentation. The Q&A is just for the young birders, but we would love to have you next month for our next J chat. So now we can see if there are any questions. Um, I know while we're waiting for some to come in, I did actually have a question. So I know that a lot of these burrowing owls, especially ones near the coast, like in southwestern Florida, there's probably kind of a risk from hurricanes. Do you know like what burrowing owls do, especially being like an underground species, when a hurricane comes near?
Yeah. So we've seen a couple studies from this. So there's two things that happen. The first is that if a hurricane or any kind of storms coming through and flooding doesn't occur, a lot of times they can just hunker in place underground, and that usually isn't a problem. We've also seen from storms that if flooding does occur and water starts getting into the burrow, they will disperse. A lot of times leaving young behind if it's in the breeding season, unfortunately. So flooding's a big risk, especially for those coastal birds. But they don't really leave the burrows if it's just like strong wind or any other issues. There can be, risk of potential collapse if something like falls onto the burrow, but that doesn't happen too much. Like if you're talking about like the birds in Marco Island or the birds in Fort Myers, the biggest risk is flooding, depending on how close they are to the coast. Um, so that is a potential that can be pretty devastating if the hurricane comes in during the breeding season. The way the timing works out, that when the burrowing owls usually will lay their first eggs by March. So if their first clutch is successful and the birds will start to fledge by the beginning of July, through July, that's usually the timing. So if it works out and our first hurricanes don't hit till August, a lot of times those birds can disperse. Although there's a lot of risks with that because they're moving um, sometimes large distances and then they no longer have a place to shelter. So there's a lot of risks involved with hurricanes, but the biggest risk is flooding. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, gotcha. That's really interesting. It's just, I don't know, it's so weird to think about a little bird being like underground and what do they really do? But
Yeah.
so we did get a question in the chat. So someone was asking, how does the trap work when you're going to ban them, I guess?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll go back to that slide. So well, actually, when we're just trying to get the young, if it's a setup like this, this black bucket that you see this gentleman reaching into at the moment, if we're just trying to get the young, that black bucket is going to be flush or even with the ground. So when we go up to just pull those chicks out, we can just pull the lid off the bucket, and the chicks are kind of just staring in awe and don't know what to do. So we can just kind of pick them up, and that's easy. But when we're trying to catch the adults, so if you see, like, for example, if we're trying to catch the adults, right here at the entrance of this burrow, we'll put that trap right up to the entrance. So they can't get out unless they go through this metal trap. And we cover it so it's still dark. They still think they're in, the tunnel. But then this left side of this trap, where it's like a slanted door, we actually pull up, and that way it's open. So right, it's currently closed, but we pull it up, and there's a little latch there that keeps it open. And then it's this diagonal metal piece that you can kind of see in the middle of the trap is connected to that metal blank spot. So in the trap, there's like a little weighted uh, basically plate. And when an animal, or in this case a burrowing owl, steps on the plate to try to get out, the door behind it closes. and it can't get out until we go over there and remove it. So it's so a lot of times when they're trying to catch like raccoons or they're trying to catch armadillos or possums or whatever, they will put food in the trap to lure the animal in.
Yeah.
Here we just use a speaker playing a call by a burrowing owl, and the one inside the burrow gets defensive and runs out. Usually it's the adults we're trying to catch in that way, and they'll run out, and then we'll be able to get them in the trap.
Gotcha. Super cool. Okay, we got a few more questions. Let's see. Someone asked, do they mate for life?
That's a good question. So, as far as we know, the burrowing owls in Florida typically return to the same site, and it's a fancy term called fidelity, which means that every year those birds might move off the breeding grounds, or go away from their main burrow during what's called the non-breeding season. So during the winter, they might explore more to find food, but they usually come straight back to that same site. The males are a little bit better at returning to that same site. But most of the time, the females will come back too. It's not as high as like cranes or eagles, which are do mate for life. But they will continue to return to that site unless they weren't successful, or maybe they found another site earlier. So it's not, we can't say they mate for life, but they typically will return if they continue to be successful and
Okay,
raise new young.
cool. Let's see. Someone else asked, how did they do during Hurricane Ian? Um, I know it flooded, rained through a lot of their range. Okay, yeah. So they're wondering, I wonder, like, they decline, they kind of just stay the same. How did they do?
Yeah, I don't know the specifics from that hurricane specifically. I would imagine, just based on what we know about their ecology, that a lot of the birds that were living in Marco Island and Fort Myers probably dispersed or left that area and moved east, because Marco Island specifically, there was a lot of flooding. I can't remember when Ian hit specifically off the top of my head. But I would imagine that, yeah, there was a decrease in the population in Southwest Florida
Yeah.
because of that storm.
Okay. And I think that hit, so that would have hit after their breeding season though.
Okay,
Right,
cool.
because that was in September. So that would have been
Yes, so
okay.
yeah, most of they would have fledged by then. That's right. But I know
Okay.
Fort Myers flooded a lot, so most of them probably dispersed and left that area for a while. And then I know there's owls back, so they probably returned.
Okay, cool. Let's see what else is in here. What do you need to attract them to your yard? How much space do they need? It's what Archer asked.
Yeah. So I only know of three spots in Florida where they're persisting in people's yards. So there's Marco Island and Fort Myers that are in Southwest Florida, and then there's a site on the East Coast, in Palm Beach County, near Palm Beach and Sunrise. So a lot of times the birds that exist in the yard, they can live in very small spaces, quote unquote. Um, like, you've seen some of those photos. I can go back to that slide. So the birds here in that top right, that's really not that much space, like even less than an acre, but it really depends on what's surrounding it. So a lot of times they will move into vacant lots first, because there's enough area between the yards and the vacant lots that they can actually search for food. So it depends on what's around the area too. Um, the only I don't think anyone's trying to attract them to your yards, but of course, making sandy open areas can always help.
Yeah.
And being next to a wetland ditch, or being across the street from a preserve or something like that probably makes your yard look more attractive. But don't think they're actively trying to attract burrowing owls to some people's yards. I could be wrong about that because I haven't worked with these
Yeah.
populations, but that's my guess.
Okay. Gotcha. Let's see. Will asked, how close can people come to the birds in their nests? Is there like a good distance to view them from?
Yeah, so that really depends on where you're looking at the birds. So here in this urban setting, you can probably get pretty close to the birds without them leaving. So, but you want to keep a safe distance even in this setting, so you're not stressing the birds out. So if they're usually burrowing owls, what they do when they want to leave. So for example, in this map, ooh, where am I at here? There we go. In this map, what we'll do when we're trying to figure out where other burrows are when we're doing a first survey is we'll find them on one burrow. And then, for example, if I found them at 9p, what we'll do is we will approach them and then they will flush to another burrow so we can then find that next burrow. But usually when they flush, they're already a little stressed. So outside of the context of conservation and management, you don't want to get so close where they're going to leave. And that's really important during the breeding season because we don't know what they're trying to take care of and we don't know what predators are around. So try to look and watch the birds. Try not to get closer than a couple, in a natural setting, like 50 to 100 feet is probably plenty far. In an urban setting, you can probably get closer to the birds because they're more used to humans. But if they're starting to flush, or they also do this fun behavior where they'll bob up and down, trying to check you out, trying to see what you're doing. Usually, if you start seeing that behavior, they're also already aware of you, already watching your movements. So try to be respectful of that space. But
Yeah. Okay, so it sounds like the ones living closer to people definitely are a lot more used to seeing people around. So that's kind of interesting. They've gotten used to people. I guess that's why they're in their yards. So, or
yeah,
maybe they're
yeah.
more used to people because they're in the yards. I don't know. Interesting.
Yeah, a little bit of a circular argument
Yeah,
there, but
yeah.
yes, people in the urban burrowing owls in the urban settings are definitely more used to humans and activities we do, but at the
Mhm.
same time, we don't want to get too close.
Yeah,
Still give them their distance.
for sure. Let's see. It looks like we have one more question. Ethan said, "Do you find that, especially managing ranches or cow pastures, conflicts with the landowner's schedules or typical procedures? Are the landowners normally compliant or reasonable about what y'all are doing?"
That's a really good question, and I could probably talk about that for like an hour. Um, So sometimes yes, sometimes no. Here in this case, as you see on this map, this is a publicly owned piece of property, and the cattle pastures here are leased to cattle ranchers. So the property's owned publicly. They have to abide by the management recommendations that we give them or we gave them at the time to make sure that they're being managed appropriately. When you're talking about private property, it becomes a little more complex. You always have to keep in mind that you're really just recommending things to do as long as those private ranchers aren't intentionally doing anything that puts the birds in harm's way. Um, then they're not doing anything illegal. And a lot of times these birds are persisting on the habitat just as the ranchers are managing them. But we always try to provide additional recommendations. And that's kind of how you have to go into it is that we encourage you to do XYZ to make the habitat even better. But it's a delicate conversation because a lot of people don't like being told what to do.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Well, gotcha. I don't think we have any more questions in the chat. Anybody has one, just put it on in there. I do have one kind of maybe not as deep as that last question from Ethan, but I was wondering if there's like any visual differences in plumage or anything from the Florida birds compared to the like Western US birds, or maybe the ones in South America. Can you tell the difference with them, or no?
So, yeah, I didn't even mention like that there is actually a difference between the sexes. So, it's very subtle, and you usually have to train your eye. So in this picture, you see that there's a little bit more white in the male, which is on the right here, especially around the collar and on the forehead, than the female on the left. The other major differences is between the subspecies. If I go back to this map, so the migratory species are actually a little bit bigger, not very much. We're talking on average a couple inches and a couple grams. So the Western, I'm not familiar at all with the southern species
Okay.
and the species that exist on the islands, but there is a slight size difference. And I'm having a memory of there being a different eye color uh, for some of them, but maybe that's towies. I think I'm confusing it with towies. So yeah, I think it's just the sizes, but I'll research that and I'll email you.
Gotcha. Okay, well, awesome. Thank you. Let's see. Does anybody have any more questions? We could maybe take a couple more.
And
Have-
I'll put my email in the chat. Um, I think I'm doing this right. In case anybody has any questions about burrowing owls, and that will come to you later, or um, hopefully
Perfect.
I did that right. I might have only sent it to you, Blair. So yeah, like I
Yeah,
said in
I
the
think
introduction
everybody will.
to. Okay, cool. Like I said in the introduction to, I've worked for a few different places around the state, and I'm currently at UF. So if you have any interest in uh, working with birds later after you're done with school, let me know.
Awesome. Okay, it looks like we don't have any more questions. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming. If you want to stick around and share any cool bird sightings, just you totally can. If not, thank you. Our next meeting should be, I think it's October 21st. So just make sure that you can try to come to that. Should be awesome. And thank you, Zach, so much for sharing so much about those little owls. That was great. So glad you could make it. Share. Thank you. Okay. Well, looks like everybody's kind of signing off.
Yeah, I don't know. We can, if people want to stick around and chat about birds, we can
Owls,
unmute people.
birds.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. Awesome.
I can't hear people's videos on. I'm trying to figure that out.
Yeah, if you just want to stop the recording, it should be down at the bottom.